Hey everyone. Hello, hello. Kimsey Bergwin here. It feels so good to be here today on this Monday. There's very fall vibes outside here in Colorado. Even though it's kind of early, I feel like normally it's like September 1st hits and suddenly the lighting change and the smell in the air changes and it just feels like fall. But I don't know, kind of getting those vibes right now, which is the best. Fall is the best. So I'm here for it. But welcome, everyone. Today, I'm going to talk about something that I would guess a lot of people, some people might raise their hand. If we had a room full of 100 people and we asked, raise your hand if you feel stressed, I feel like 50% of people would raise their hand and 50% wouldn't. But that has more to do with the question than it does the actual experience of those people. And that's because stress, that word, generate certain, behaviors or experiences or feelings in us that we may or may not resonate with at that time. But the reality is that word really doesn't do it justice when we're really talking about the physiology of stress. So that's what I'm going to talk about today is nervous system dysregulation, which is a much more nuanced way of describing feeling stressed because we don't all feel stressed like, I'm sitting in traffic, or I'm so overwhelmed at work, or my relationship is toxic, or like whatever, right? We might not all feel it in that same way. It can show up in a number of different ways. And it is one of the key things that negative drivers, I'll say, of health, of mental health, of physical health, it will aggravate every condition. I talk a lot about anxiety. That is something I'm very passionate about working with. And nervous system dysregulation is, obviously a key player in that, especially for when it's so subtle in a way that it's difficult to even realize that we are dysregulated. So that's what I'm going to talk about today are exactly what nervous system dysregulation is, the different types of stress response that there are. I'll talk about different signs and symptoms, how this can show up, and then of course talk about different methods, tools for helping to re-regulate your nervous system. Because ultimately, if you don't take anything else away from this conversation today, take away this: the body can only heal in a relaxed state. The body can only heal in a relaxed state. What I mean by relaxed is a regulated state. I know I don't mean that you have to be like lounging in a hot tub all day long and you can't feel any amount of stress, right? That's not what I'm saying. But it has to feel safe. The body can only heal when it feels safe. That's what I mean by relaxed state. I should say that. The body can only heal when it feels safe. Okay, and I'll explain what safe means. There's so many things that we'll talk about. So, for those of you that are logging on, it looks like we've got a few people joining. Hello, thank you for being here. I'm on YouTube, I'm on Facebook, I'm in my Facebook group, Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness. And that is where I archive all of my talks, by the way. So if you're watching this and you want to go, make sure to catch the replay of it, go to Holistic Solutions for Mental Health and Wellness on Facebook. That's also where I put out daily, I should say weekly content in addition to these lives. So, for those of you that don't know me, my name is Kimsey Bergwin. I'm an integrative nutritionist in my online nutrition and wellness practice called Progressive Health and Wellness, where I work with ambitious men and women who are struggling with their mental or physical health by taking a root caused body mind approach to optimize their overall health and wellness. So, let's talk about nervous system dysregulation and what that essentially means. So, the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, is designed to, it kind of has, to keep it really simplistic, we're going to say two states, and that would be sympathetic and parasympathetic. The parasympathetic state is the rest and digest. So that's where we're essentially meant to live, right? That's where most of our experience is supposed to be. But then when stress inevitably happens, and I'll define that, there's different types of stress. But when stress inevitably happens, we can shift into the stress response, and that is called the sympathetic nervous system. But there's different types of stress response. So the sympathetic nervous system kind of mediates or drives that stress response, and then ideally, we're designed to shift right back to that parasympathetic state. Another way of looking at it is if we respond to it, think of it like a loop, right? If we respond to a stressor, we'll respond to that stressor and then we loop back to our parasympathetic baseline. Nervous system dysregulation happens when we don't close that threat loop and we end up stuck in that hypervigilant state. So, what are some of the different ways that I'm going to say that specifically kind of break down the types of stress response? We often hear about fight or flight. So, fight, flight, freeze. There's also fawn. So, I want you to think of 4 different types of stress responses that one can have. And it's not like you just have one and then you're done, right? You can kind of move between them. So fight, flight, that fight or flight, right? That, as the name implies, that is a hypervigilant, adrenaline mediated state. So when someone encounters a stressor, that they feel like they have the ability to either combat it or to flee, the body mobilizes energy resources to do that, to do either one of those, right? So again, adrenaline, cortisol, the stress hormones will be heightened. And it's characterized by a lower heart rate variability, shift into that sympathetic nervous system drive to fight the perceived stressor or to run away from it. If the stressor feels so overwhelming that we don't have the ability to fight it or to run away from it, then we freeze. And that's where the freeze comes in. When we're talking about, I mentioned lower HRV, I should have elaborated. To elaborate on that, what I mean by that is kind of getting more into this concept of polyvagal theory and the interplay that really happens between the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic. It's not always as black and white as that sounds, right? You're in parasympathetic and then you're sympathetic. Sometimes there's this overplay between the two. And the better way of understanding how the parasympathetic and sympathetic work is think of sympathetic like yeah, right. Think of sympathetic like the gas to the car, and we're always pressing the gas on the car. If we want to be driving down the highway, we're always pressing the gas on the car. We can press it harder or we can let off on it, but we're always pressing the gas to the car. The parasympathetic nervous system is more like the braking action. So it helps tone down that sympathetic nervous system to keep it from running wild. I would think of the parasympathetic as having more of a toning effect on the sympathetic nervous system. So, all of that to say, bring us back to the freeze mechanism. And we'll get into fawn a little bit with this too. But with the freeze and the fawn mechanisms, we actually see an interplay here between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. It's not just like the fight or flight, where it's more like the sympathetic's been unleashed, if you will. Here we have this interplay. And like I said before, it's this feeling, the freeze response happens when the stressor feels so overwhelming that we don't feel like we have the capacity to directly combat it or to run away from it. So for people, this can show up in a variety of ways. It can show up with an acute, trauma with a big T kind of thing. You learn about a death in the family. You are in a startling car accident. Your safety directly feels threatened, like somebody breaks into your home. It can also show up with previous traumas that are being re-triggered, in which the original trauma response was the freeze response. So we'll see this sometimes, for example, with sexual assault victims. So victims that have experienced sexual assault and in the original moment of that stressor, they go into a freeze state. And then if they're in a situation, could be years, decades later down the line, if they're in a situation that for whatever reason, either it's directly threatening or it may not necessarily be directly threatening, but to their nervous system, it feels like it is, they may revert and respond to that same situation with the same stress response, which is to freeze. So it's almost like a learned, it can become a learned stress response if the trauma is similar, if they're experiencing a stressor that is similar to what they've experienced in the past when they had to use that stress response. So there's the freeze, and in that state, it's a shutdown, right? It's a shutdown. It can become immobilizing. Literally, that's why they call it freeze, right? But it's also worth mentioning that people can get stuck in that state too. Just like people can get stuck in the fight or flight, you can get stuck in more of this freeze or the fawn, which I'll talk about. And we'll see that more as dorsal vagal shutdown is kind of what it's referred to as scientifically, if you will. But quite literally, the nervous system kind of shuts down in a way to go into sensory protective mode. So we'll see other symptoms with that. Sometimes it can be depression. Sometimes it can be sleeping for excessively long hours. Sometimes it can be physical pain, constipation, muscle achiness, almost a heaviness. So we'll see how people can get stuck in that state too. You can get kind of stuck in any of these dysregulated states. That's essentially what dysregulation, excuse me, is. And then the last one is fawn. And fawn is, think of it like trying to appease a situation by appease the threat that you're being experienced to by taking on almost like a submissive role. So I like to imagine, a child that perhaps had an abusive parent or an adult that's in an abusive romantic relationship, not even necessarily romantic, but there's this, power dynamic, and one person may take on this, like, kind of doing whatever they can to appease, it's out of fear to appease the threat from worsening. So that's kind of a difficult, more nuanced stress response, not necessarily something that we would see play out more commonly or in everyday life, but it absolutely can. Especially we see that happen more in adults that have experienced childhood trauma. So those are the 4 different more nuanced stress responses. It's not always just the fight or flight, right? So there's the more nuanced stress responses. So, to get now into what is happening with nervous system dysregulation, first I want to explain how, well, so two forms of the how, if you will. So, the first one is, how does this come to be? How does the nervous system become dysregulated? And that can happen from chronic day stress, like chronic daily stress, or or from life altering stressors. So there's like trauma with a small t, if you will, is how it's sometimes described, and then trauma with a big T. And the excuse me, I'm kind of getting over a cold. Mm. So the trauma with a small t can be anything that disrupts your nervous system. I mean, simply put, that's it. Anything that disrupts your nervous system. Anything that you find dysregulating, anything that, just simply that, anything that disrupts your nervous system. Trauma with the big T, I think of as an experience that overwhelmed your ability to cope in the moment. So either one of those, and again, many people will have both, right? They've experienced significant big T trauma and they're living in the daily little t trauma. But To go back to defining what this dysregulation is when that threat loop never actually closes. So, what I mean by that is nervous system dysregulation happens when we're living out past stressors, where our nervous system is responding to past stressors in the present moment, as if they're happening in the present moment. This takes a much more broad, much more nuanced response to the term stress, right? Because the problem with this is humans are adaptive by nature. We're adaptive creatures. We can adapt to different environments. We can adapt to different situations, right? We're adaptive. We can adapt to, albeit dysfunctionally, we can adapt to stress. And so I learned very early in my career, if you ask someone if they're stressed, if you asked me if I'm stressed, I'd probably say like, no, not really. Like I don't generally feel stressed. But then you really understand what stress is and start to understand what nervous system dysregulation is and the different ways that it can show up. And we really start to appreciate like everyone is probably carrying a certain level of that. The severity may be different, but everyone is carrying a certain level of that unless someone is taking active steps to be aware and mindful and work their way through it. I really think that just living, just living in this world, you're going to end up with some kind of dysregulated nervous system. And I think at this point, it is like having the tools to become more mindful and aware of it and then help your nervous system feel safe again, is no longer an option. I think it's a requirement for being alive at this point if you want to feel healthy in your mind and body. So, how dysregulated nervous system can show up? I'm going to list out some of the different ways. Um, More easily reactive, right? Do you find that you are snappy? Maybe you're impatient. You are snap at your kids, you snap at your spouse, you snap at your coworkers or your friends. Little things are getting to you, little things that you kind of you step back and you're like, "God, why is this annoying me?" Or yeah, just the little things start to accumulate. The little things are really aggravating. Feeling anxiety, feeling depression, feeling anxious, um, frequently feeling overwhelmed or on edge. Perhaps you notice more ruminating thoughts. So you find yourself replaying old conversations. You find yourself anticipating conversations you might have to have. You find yourself ruminating on just ruminating on certain things, right? Because so, like replaying scenarios, replaying situations, experiences, feelings in your head. It could be insomnia. Do you have difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep? Especially, do you notice that you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about something or ruminating on certain things? It could be digestive, right? It can show up in your digestive system. Do you have bloating, acid reflux, diarrhea, constipation, and you've tried everything for it perhaps, and nothing's really seems to be helping? Maybe you haven't tried anything for it yet, but you've noted you identify with that, right? You have digestive symptoms. It could be blood pressure. Do you notice hypertension? Do you notice migraines? Do you notice physical pain? Do you notice hormonal imbalances? Women, do you have PMS or especially irritability or depression around the menstrual cycle or anxiety around the menstrual cycle? Heavy cramping? Women transitioning into menopause, perimenopause, and menopause, is that transition difficult for you? Are you feeling like fried and like you just don't have again, easily overwhelmed? You don't have the resiliency that you used to. Those can be some of the symptoms of a dysregulated nervous system. So, how do we, because I feel again, the body can only heal when it feels safe. And ultimately, a dysregulated nervous system, it doesn't feel safe. The nervous system doesn't feel safe. And that can manifest in a number of different ways. It can manifest as all the symptoms I just described. It can manifest as immune dysfunction. It can manifest as anxiety. It can manifest in a number of ways. But as autoimmune conditions, I mean, infertility, like a number of things. So it's important to be able to teach it how to feel safe again. So here are some key ways to do that. And these are all grounded in polyvagal theory. So getting back to strengthening the vagus nerve, which is the largest, I'm pointing here because it runs like from the brainstem, all innervates everything in the thoracic region. It is the largest parasympathetic nervous system mediator, one of the largest nerves in the body. And like anything in the nervous system, if you don't use it, you lose it. So we can weaken vagal tone, is what it's called, if we're living in this dysregulated place. And that braking system becomes weak, and it has a much harder time effectively braking the sympathetic nervous system. So number one is breath work. I know that sounds redundant. I'm sure people are like, "Oh my God, really? Is she gonna go here with that?" I hear that all the time. But yes, breath work, because our breath is autonomically controlled. So we don't have to think about it, right? It's autonomically controlled. But it's one thing within that autonomic nervous system that we can control. We can't control our heartbeat, right? But we can control our breathing rate. And the breath is both a response and a tool to train our nervous system. It's a response, meaning if you're not paying attention, your breathing will, when you're not paying attention, your breathing changes when you're stressed, right? You breathe more shallowly, you breathe through the chest instead of the diaphragm. And that cascades, that tells the body we're not safe. We're running from something, we're not safe. Conversely, we can tap into that by changing our breath. We can tell our body that we're safe physiologically. Because here's one big thing. When you're dysregulated already, that subconscious mind, the autonomic nervous system is, I don't know how many times more powerful than your conscious mind. You cannot think yourself out of stress. You can't tell yourself to calm down. You can't tell yourself to let it go. You can't tell yourself it's no big deal. You have to feel it. You have to shift your state. And that is what breath work can do. So, an easy thing, set a timer on your phone. Do this throughout the day, but especially on the bookend hours of the day. Timer on your phone, 5 minutes if that's all you have, 10 minutes, however much you can take. Place one hand on your belly, one hand on your chest. I want you to breathe in only through the hand on your belly, the diaphragm, through your nose, not your mouth. Inhale to a count of 4, exhale to a count of 5. Do that. Focus your attention on your heart. So if it starts going into your to-do list, etc., what you should have said in that conversation 10 years ago, focus your attention on your heart. Breathe in through the belly, breathe out through the belly, through the nose. Inhale 4, exhale 5. That is number one. Do that throughout your day. Check in with yourself. Set a timer on your phone to check in with yourself and how you're breathing, and then consciously shift it. Number 2 is get outside in nature. Nature therapy is very real. In Japan, they call it nature bathing. There are negative ions. There is the beauty of nature. There's the fresh air, the sunlight. There's all the different reasons. But ultimately, there is a balancing effect that nature has on us. So if that's going for a walk, if it's sitting outside and reading a book, if it's sitting on a bench and people watching, whatever it is, if it's a park, if it's a trail, if it's by a lake, it doesn't matter, but anywhere in nature, and spend however much time you can. Do your breath work there. But getting out in nature can help immensely. And number 3 is spending time with people that make you feel seen, safe, and heard. This can be a therapist, it can be a friend, it can be pets, it can be loved ones, it can be a support group, it can be a meetup group, it can be a team, it can be whatever it is, but spending time with those people. Often, when we feel dysregulated, we want to isolate, and that can make it worse because then we just get in our own heads. But if you go and spend time with people, and quite literally the ventral vagus, there's a the way that the nervous system perceives facial expressions, it's wild. But this is a big part of how the vagus nerve learns and regulates. That's why children don't have the ability to self-regulate. Like young kids don't have the ability to self-regulate. We co-regulate. And even as adults, we often need that. We need co-regulation. And that is what spending time with people that feel make us feel safe, seen, and heard can do, is we are able to co-regulate much more easily than we can regulate ourselves sometimes. So, if this resonates, and I wish I had time to go into like my personal story and my experience with this, but truly, I think this is something that more awareness needs to be brought to, and really looking deeply at how this might be showing up in your body and implementing these little things to help shift your nervous system over time. So if this resonates with you, drop a comment. Let me know what your experience is, what has helped you the most in regulating your nervous system. And I would love to get a dialogue started. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.